Let me make something very clear right from the beginning. Because cases like this are not complicated by law. They are complicated by people, by assumptions, by shortcuts, and by the belief that you can transfer responsibility without actually doing the work required to transfer it. And that is exactly what we have here, because the plaintiff, Ashley Carter, walks into this courtroom claiming that she is being unfairly held responsible for a car lease that she says she no longer had control over, while the defendant, Brittany Lopez, stands here insisting that she never agreed to take on that responsibility in the way Ashley is now describing it. And when I hear something like that, I already know this is not just about a car. This is about a misunderstanding that was allowed to grow into a legal problem, because somewhere along the way, both of these individuals made decisions without making things clear, and now they are both trying to explain those decisions in a way that benefits them. But in my courtroom, explanations don't win cases. Facts do, contracts do, and actions do. So let's start from the beginning. Ashley Carter had a leased vehicle, a legal contract with a leasing company, and that contract made her fully responsible for the payments, the condition of the car, and everything associated with it. Now at some point, Ashley decides she can no longer maintain that lease. Maybe it was financial pressure. Maybe it was a change in circumstances. But whatever the reason, she wanted out. And instead of going through the proper channels, instead of contacting the leasing company and arranging an official transfer, she found what she believed was a simpler solution. She approached Brittany Lopez and made an agreement. An informal one, that Brittany would take the car, make the payments, and essentially step into her role. And on the surface, that might sound like a solution, but in reality, it's the beginning of a problem. Because when you sign a lease, you are not entering into an agreement with a friend. You are entering into an agreement with a company. And that company has rules, requirements, and procedures that must be followed if anything is going to change. And Ashley Carter did not follow those procedures. She did not get approval. She did not sign any official transfer documents. She did not remove her name from the lease. And that means that legally, nothing changed, no matter what she believed. No matter what Brittany Lopez agreed to informally. The contract remained exactly the same. Ashley Carter was still responsible. Now Brittany Lopez does not deny that she took the car. She does not deny that she made some payments. But she strongly disputes the idea that she took over the lease in a legal sense. She says this was never presented to her as a full transfer of responsibility. She says she believed she was helping Ashley, that she was using the car and covering payments temporarily, not signing up for a long-term financial obligation tied to a contract she never even saw. And that distinction is critical, because if one person believes they are transferring a legal obligation and the other believes they are simply helping out, then you don't have an agreement, you have confusion. And confusion is not enforceable. Now I ask Ashley Carter a very simple question. Did you contact the leasing company? And the answer is no. I ask her if there is any document, any email, any approval that shows Brittany Lopez was officially added or that she herself was removed. And again, the answer is no. And that tells me everything I need to know about the foundation of this case. Because without that approval, this so-called transfer does not exist in the eyes of the law. It exists only between the two of them. And that is not enough to change legal responsibility. Ashley tries to argue that Brittany Lopez knew what she was getting into, that she accepted the car, that she made payments, that she acted as if she had taken over. And while those actions may create a certain expectation between individuals, they do not override a signed contract with a third party. And that's something people often fail to understand. You cannot rewrite a contract privately. You cannot decide that responsibility has shifted just because you both agreed verbally. The law does not work that way. Now I turn to Brittany Lopez and ask her directly, what did you believe this arrangement was? And she answers in a way that is consistent with her defense. She says she never signed anything, never agreed to be legally bound, never spoke to the leasing company, and never believed she was replacing Ashley Carter in the contract. She believed she was simply using the car and helping with payments. And that belief is supported by the fact that nothing formal was ever done. And now we have the core issue clearly in front of us. Ashley Carter assumed she had transferred responsibility. Brittany Lopez assumed she had not accepted it. And both of them acted on those assumptions without ever making anything official. And that is exactly how situations like this end up in court. Because when reality finally catches up, Someone has to answer for it, and usually, it's the person whose name is still on the contract. Now Ashley looks frustrated because from her perspective, she did everything she thought was necessary. She found someone. She handed over the car. She believed the problem was solved. But belief is not a substitute for legal process. And that's something I make very clear. Because if you want to get out of a lease, you do it the right way. You go through the company. You get approval. You sign the documents. And only then are you free of that obligation. Anything less than that is a risk. And in this case, that risk has now become a reality. But the case does not end there, because Brittany Lopez's involvement is not insignificant either. Taking the car, using it, making payments, and then something happens that causes everything to fall apart. And that is where this case starts to shift from a simple misunderstanding to a full dispute. Because now I want to know exactly what went wrong. When did the payments stop? Why did they stop? What happened to the car? And how did this situation escalate to the point where Ashley Carter is still being held responsible for something she thought was no longer hers? And as both sides prepare to answer those questions, it becomes very clear that this case is not just about a lease anymore. It's about accountability, broken expectations, and the consequences of trying to take shortcuts in situations where shortcuts simply do not work. Now let me tell you where things start falling apart. Because up until this point, what we have is poor judgment and unclear communication. But what turns a situation into a legal dispute is what happens next. And that is exactly what I want to understand. Because Ashley Carter claims that after Brittany Lopez took possession of the car, everything seemed fine in the beginning. The payments were being made. There were no complaints, no red flags, nothing that suggested there was a problem. And for Ashley, that period of time reinforced her belief that the arrangement was working, that Brittany had effectively taken over, and that she herself no longer needed to worry about the lease. But here is the problem with relying on assumptions. Just because something works temporarily does not mean it is secure. And in this case, that temporary stability was about to collapse. Now I turn to Brittany Lopez and ask her directly, "Did you make payments?" And she says yes, she did. She confirms that she paid for a certain period of time, which tells me that she did accept some level of responsibility, even if she claims it was informal. Because people don't usually make payments on something they believe has nothing to do with them so clearly. She understood that she had a role in this arrangement. But then I asked the next question, the one that matters the most. What happened? Why did the payments stop? And this is where the story begins to shift again. Because Brittany explains that something changed in her situation, whether it was financial difficulty, personal circumstances, or simply a decision that she could no longer continue. She stopped making the payments, and from her perspective, she believed that since the lease was never officially hers, the ultimate responsibility still remained with Ashley Carter. And that is where the conflict becomes unavoidable, because Ashley sees this as a breach of their agreement. She believes Brittany took the car, benefited from it, made payments, and then suddenly walked away, leaving her with the consequences. While Brittany sees it differently, she believes she was never fully responsible to begin with, and therefore stopping payments was not the same as breaking a contract, because in her mind, she never signed one. And that difference in understanding is exactly why they are standing here now. Now I ask Ashley Carter, when did you realize there was a problem? And she explains that it was when the payments stopped, and the leasing company came after her. Because from the company's perspective, nothing had changed. Her name was still on the lease. She was still the responsible party. And that is when reality hit. Because suddenly the arrangement she thought had solved her problem had actually created a bigger one. Now she is dealing with missed payments, possible penalties, and damage to her financial standing. And all of that traces back to a decision she made without completing the proper process. And that is something I cannot ignore. But I also cannot ignore Brittany Lopez's actions. Because taking possession of a car, using it, making payments, and then stopping without resolving the situation creates its own set of issues. Because even if there was no formal contract with the leasing company, there was still an understanding between the two individuals. And that understanding carries weight, especially when one party benefits from the arrangement and the other is left with the consequences. So now I start digging deeper. I ask Brittany, what happened to the car after you stopped making payments? Did you return it? Did you inform Ashley? Did you try to resolve the situation? And her answers become very important. Because responsibility is not just about what you agreed to. It is also about how you handle a situation when things go wrong. If she simply stopped paying and walked away without properly returning the car or notifying Ashley, then that behavior reflects a lack of responsibility, even if she was not legally bound to the lease itself. And this is where people often misunderstand their position. Just because you are not legally on a contract does not mean you can act without consequence. Your actions still affect other people, and in this case, those actions had a direct impact on Ashley Carter. Now, Ashley argues that Brittany should be held accountable for the period she had the car, for the payments she failed to make, and for the damage caused by her walking away, while Brittany continues to maintain that she never agreed to take on full responsibility, and therefore cannot be treated as if she did. And both arguments have elements that need to be considered carefully, because this is not a simple case of one person being entirely right and the other entirely wrong. This is a situation where both parties made mistakes. But the question is, whose mistake carries the legal responsibility? And that is where the distinction becomes critical. Because Ashley Carter's mistake was failing to properly transfer the lease, which means she remains legally responsible to the leasing company. That part is clear, but Brittany Lopez's mistake was stepping into an arrangement, benefiting from it, and then failing to handle the exit properly, which creates a separate layer of accountability between the two of them. And that is exactly what I need to determine: how much responsibility each party carries. Not in theory, but in practical terms. Because at the end of the day, someone has to answer for the missed payments. Someone has to deal with the consequences. And the law does not operate on assumptions, it operates on obligations. And as I listen to both sides, compare their timelines, and evaluate their actions, it becomes very clear that this case is not just about a lease anymore. It is about the consequences of informal agreements in situations that require formal ones. And as I prepare to examine the details even further, one thing is certain: this situation did not have to end up here. But now that it has, someone is going to be held accountable. And the question is, to what extent and for what? Exactly. Now this is the point where I stop listening to what people think happened, and I start focusing on what actually happened. Because there is a difference. And that difference is what decides cases. Not emotions, not assumptions, but facts backed by actions. And right now, both Ashley Carter and Brittany Lopez have given me their versions. But versions don't resolve disputes. Consistency does, so I begin to test that consistency. I go back to Brittany Lopez and I start asking very specific questions, not general ones, because general answers are where people hide. Specifics are where the truth shows up. I ask her exactly how long she had the car, how many payments she made, and at what point she decided to stop. And as she answers, I'm not just listening to the words. I'm watching the timeline. Because timelines don't lie. People do, and what I'm looking for is whether her actions match her claim that this was only temporary help. Because if it was truly temporary, then there should have been a clear end, a clear communication, something that shows she treated it like a limited arrangement. But what I'm seeing instead is a pattern where she stepped into the situation, used the car, made payments as if she had taken on responsibility, and then when circumstances changed, she stepped out without properly closing that arrangement. And that is not how responsible behavior looks, regardless of whether there was a formal contract or not. Now I turn to Ashley Carter, because she is not free from scrutiny either. And I make that very clear. I ask her why she believed that a private agreement was enough to remove her from a legal contract, why she didn't follow up with the leasing company, why she didn't secure anything in writing. Because if you are trying to transfer something as serious as a lease, you don't rely on trust alone, you rely on documentation. And her answers reflect what I see in many cases like this. She thought it would be fine. She believed that because Brittany was making payments, the responsibility had shifted. And that belief is exactly what put her in this position. Because belief does not override a contract. And that is something I repeat often. Because people need to understand it. You cannot think your way out of a legal obligation. You either follow the process or you remain responsible. And in this case, Ashley Carter remained responsible whether she liked it or not. But that does not mean Brittany Lopez walks away without any accountability. Because what she did created a situation where Ashley was left dealing with consequences she did not expect at that point in time. And that matters. So now I start breaking this down in a way that both of them, and anyone listening, can understand clearly. I explained that there are two separate relationships here. One between Ashley Carter and the leasing company, and another between Ashley Carter and Brittany Lopez. And those two relationships are not the same. The first one is a legal contract, binding, enforceable, and unchanged, which means Ashley is responsible to the leasing company. That part is not even a question. But the second relationship, the one between Ashley and Brittany, is where this dispute exists, because that is based on an agreement. Informal, unclear, but still an agreement. And agreements, even informal ones, carry weight when actions support them. And in this case, Brittany's actions show that she accepted some level of responsibility, even if she did not accept the full legal obligation. And that distinction is where the outcome of this case is going to come from. Because I am not here to rewrite the lease. I cannot remove Ashley's name from a contract she signed with a third party, but I can determine whether Brittany owes her something, based on the arrangement they had and the way it was handled. And that is exactly what I intend to do. Now I go deeper into Brittany's conduct. I ask her whether she informed Ashley before stopping payments, whether she gave her any notice, whether she returned the car in a proper condition, because those details matter. They show whether she acted responsibly when the situation changed. And her answers reveal that things were not handled as carefully as they should have been. There was no clear communication, no structured handover back, just a situation that was allowed to fall apart. And that is where accountability comes in. Because even if you did not sign a contract, you cannot create a problem for someone else and then step away as if it has nothing to do with you. And that is something I make very clear to her. Because people need to understand that responsibility is not only defined by contracts, it is also defined by conduct. And her conduct contributed directly to the situation Ashley Carter is now dealing with. At the same time, I remind Ashley that she cannot shift the entire burden onto Brittany, because the root of this problem started with her decision to bypass the proper process. If she had gone through the leasing company, if she had secured an official transfer, if she had ensured that her name was removed, we would not be here. And that is an important point. Because while Brittany's actions made the situation worse, they did not create the original risk. That risk was already there from the moment Ashley chose to handle this informally. And that is why this case is not one-sided. It is layered, it involves shared mistakes, but different levels of responsibility. And now the courtroom is quiet, because both of them are starting to see the situation more clearly, not as they believed it, but as it actually is. And that is when I prepare to move toward the financial aspect. Because at the end of the day, this is not just about understanding what went wrong. It is about deciding what needs to be done about it, who owes what, and why. And as I review everything that has been said, every action that has been taken, and every consequence that has followed, it becomes clear that the final decision is not going to be as simple as one person wins and the other loses. It is going to reflect the reality of what happened. And that reality is that both Ashley Carter and Brittany Lopez played a role in creating this situation. But one of them is going to have to answer for it in a very specific way. And that is exactly where this case is heading next. And now we come to the point where everything has to be decided, not based on who feels more wronged, not based on who tells the better story, but based on responsibility. Because that is what this case has always been about from the very beginning. And after listening to both Ashley Carter and Brittany Lopez, after examining what was said, what was done, and what was not done, the situation is actually very clear, even if it did not feel that way when it started. Because Ashley Carter entered into a legal contract with the leasing company, and that contract was never properly transferred, never approved, never changed in any official capacity, which means that as far as the law is concerned, she remained responsible the entire time. And that is not something I can ignore or rewrite, because contracts do not disappear based on private agreements. They change only when the proper process is followed. And that process was not followed here. However, that does not mean Brittany Lopez walks away without accountability. Because while she may not have signed the lease, she stepped into the situation. She took possession of the car. She used it. She made payments. And through her actions, she created a clear understanding that she was taking on some level of responsibility. And that is where her obligation comes in. Because you cannot benefit from an arrangement, act as if you are part of it, and then walk away without addressing the consequences when things go wrong. And that is exactly what happened here. Brittany Lopez stopped making payments, did not properly resolve the situation and left Ashley Carter to deal with the financial fallout. And that is not acceptable conduct, regardless of whether there was a formal contract between them or not. Because responsibility is not just about what you sign, it is also about what you do. So here is how I see it. Ashley Carter remains legally responsible to the leasing company. That is her contract, her obligation. And that does not change. But Brittany Lopez is responsible to Ashley Carter for the period in which she had the car and failed to fulfill the payments she had effectively taken on. And that means she owes compensation for that failure, not because she was on the lease, but because her actions created a situation where Ashley suffered financial consequences. And fairness requires that she be held accountable for that part of it. And that is the distinction people need to understand. You cannot escape a contract by handing it off informally. And you cannot step into a situation, benefit from it, and then walk away as if it had nothing to do with you. Both of those things lead to exactly what we have here. A dispute that could have been avoided with clarity, with proper process, and with responsible behavior from the start. So my judgment reflects that reality. Ashley Carter is responsible for her contract, but Brittany Lopez is responsible for her actions, and she is ordered to compensate Ashley for the missed payments and related losses during the time she had control of the vehicle. And that is a fair outcome based on what actually happened, not what either side now wishes had happened. And let this be a lesson, because this is not just about a car. This is about understanding that legal responsibility cannot be transferred casually, and personal agreements do not override formal obligations. If you want out of something, you do it the right way. And if you step into something, you handle it responsibly until it is properly resolved. Otherwise, you end up exactly where these two individuals are today, standing in court trying to fix a problem that should never have reached this point. And now I want to hear from you, because cases like this always divide opinion. Do you think Ashley Carter was careless for not handling the lease properly? Or do you believe Brittany Lopez should be held more responsible for walking away after taking the car? And if you were in Ashley's position, would you trust someone with something like this without official paperwork? Or if you were in Brittany's place, would you ever step into a situation like this without clearly defining your role? Let me know in the comments, because your perspective might be very different. And that is exactly what makes cases like this so interesting.